Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
To the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Richard McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you on March 11th. And at this time, the movie industry is trending upward. Theaters are opening up nationwide at limited capacity, and more compelling films are making their way to theaters. Not gonna lie, it has been a little tough to talk about films that sort of have a one-note concept without many compelling features to them, but that is starting to change. And while there have been films that aren't engaging in the traditional sense of great premise, great cast, and elements like that, it has given me a chance to take a look at some films that I normally wouldn't even consider. And that is very much what this episode is going to be about. I'll be taking a look at the Russo brothers' latest picture, Cherry, which stars Tom Holland, the cyber thriller Dark Web, Circada 3301, and the movie Trust, which takes a look at a couple whose fidelity is put to the test. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, because at the time this podcast will be released, it will be the 49th anniversary of The Godfather debuting in theaters. If only it was a year later, we could have that perfect 50. But I'm going to take a look back at the film that many people consider the greatest of all time, definitely up there as one of the greatest of all time. Take a look at what it meant to the film industry and how it launched the careers of many talented actors. So be sure to stick around if you are a fan of Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, The Godfather. So the first film I wanted to talk about today is the movie Cherry. And for those listening, I just want to warn you, it is dealing with extremely mature content, so listener discretion is advised. The film is rated R, and it follows the life of an ex-soldier who, after returning home, has to deal with PTSD, and one of his vices becomes his drug addiction. The film is based on the best-selling novel of the same name by Nico Walker, and it is actually some sort of a MCU reunion, given that it is directed by Joe and Anthony Russo, and the film stars Tom Holland. Them having, of course, worked together on the films Avengers Endgame and Avengers Infinity Wars. And this film will be released March 12th on Apple TV+, after a short run in theaters where it debuted February 26th. So, without even meaning to, I will be covering a film that deals with the opioid crisis for this second straight week, having talked about the film Crisis last week, which deals with similar subject matter. So the main premise of the film centers around Tom Holland's character, who shares a name with the title, Cherry, and his journey from growing up in rural Ohio, and he enlists in the armed forces, is deployed overseas, and at a very young age is exposed to the horrors of war. And unfortunately, this character, like far too many real-life soldiers, returns from his tour of duty with PTSD. And Cherry's symptoms are described in the film as a noise in his head that won't quiet, and his chosen method on dealing with that is opioids. He inevitably develops an addiction, is put in debt because of his addiction, which results in the main conflict of the film, him having to rob banks. So this film has the elements to take the audience on a very emotional ride. And one of the things Joe Russo, one of the directors, was talking about when they were planning on adapting this film from the book was that the book really captured the psychology behind the opioid epidemic in a way that other pieces of work that covered the same topic just didn't accomplish. And him and his brother grew up in Cleveland, so they understand the setting of both the book and the film and the deindustrialization of the Midwest, and how people out there who used to have their entire economy based around a specific type of work due to regulations and jobs moving overseas, there has been a tremendous void that has yet to be filled. And that's how you get in a situation where a young man with his whole life ahead of him falls into addiction, which results in him turning to a life of crime. And it will be interesting to see Tom Holland take on this role. Obviously, most people know him as Spider-Man, a character that's usually lighthearted, happy-go-lucky, always cracking wise. So seeing Holland take on a role where he's essentially playing a drug-addicted criminal with PTSD will be a good opportunity for him to show off his range. And he was cast in this film due to his previous relationship with the Russo brothers, again from their work together in the MCU. And the Russo brothers took on this project because this is a very personal issue for them. They refer to their home state of Ohio as ground zero for the opioid epidemic. They've had family members that are currently struggling with sobriety, and they've admitted that they've even had family members that have passed away due to this addiction. So they felt compelled from a very personal standpoint to make this film and make sure that there was light being shed on the opioid epidemic. And they do talk about how Tom Holland was really perfect for this role because the character makes a lot of unlikable choices. He does a lot of things that turn the audience off to him. But they felt that Tom Holland's acting ability, as well as his ability to elicit sympathy from the audience, was the perfect fit for trying to portray a character that does a lot of really terrible things, yet the audience stays invested in his struggle. And that's a really good metaphor for addiction. People make a lot of terrible choices. They do a lot of things that are obviously the wrong thing, but they have this force inside of them compelling them to do it, to the point where it's not really even a conscious decision to them. It's a compulsive behavior that drives them instead of them driving it. And one specific point that the Russos wanted to make, and this was in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, they have a lot of overhead shots of homes in Cleveland, and they wanted that to portray the fact that this is a story being told about an individual, but it is a story of many people. And I talked a lot about this issue while talking about the film Crisis, and I think it's just a strange coincidence that two films covering the same topic are coming out so close to each other. Mostly because just the sheer amount of films that have had to have their release date shuffled. I don't think anything over the past year has met its intended release date, and the fact that they're two movies covering the same topic, which is the very heavy issue of opioid addiction in this country, and that they're coming out so close together will do a lot to shed light on this issue. Now, while the film Crisis took a look at the issue from multiple different perspectives, one, an addict that's in recovery, one person who is a researcher that is working for a pharmaceutical company that makes the drug, while another is essentially an underground drug supplier. Taking that approach in terms of storytelling does a lot to show the audience a lot of the different sides of this issue, whereas in this film Cherry, focusing in on one individual will do a lot to humanize the story. And not only does this film cover the issue of opioid addiction, it also takes on the very real issue of soldiers returning from their tours of duty and struggling with issues like PTSD, depression, which is a very real issue that veterans are dealing with. There are studies out there that say around 13 to 20% of all veterans experience PTSD. And that is comparable to the level of veterans that experience major depression, which is another reason why having an actor like Tom Holland in the lead role of this film was such a good choice, because he is so exhaustive in how he prepares for a role. He went to the VA, talked to people that had to deal with PTSD, and one of the things that really gave him the enthusiasm to attack the role was making sure that he was doing justice to the stories that he was told, because he knew that it took so much for these veterans to share their own stories of what they had to deal with when they were deployed, and what they have to deal with now that they're home and trying to readjust to a normal life, given the things that they've seen. So on a personal note, I think it's a very important message to raise awareness of the opioid epidemic, because that could affect anybody. I think the message they're sending with how veterans are dealing with PTSD and other mental issues is equally as important, because that is a little less obvious to notice. And I think it's great that an actor the level of Tom Holland is so dedicated to bringing a performance to life that he's willing to go deeper in his preparation for a role by visiting people that traditionally wouldn't have their story told. And in my last podcast, I talked about a few actors I think are worth keeping an eye on. I feel like Tom Holland, while he's already reach the level of mega stardom. He's going to be one of those actors that just gets completely lost in the roles he plays. Like how Robert De Niro did in his films Taxi Driver and Cape Fear, or like Al Pacino in character pieces like Serpico and Scarface. And if you know me, you know I don't throw out comparisons to people like that very often, but I think Tom Holland is already of that caliber, and as he goes forward in his career, his character work is going to be something to keep an eye on. He already has punched his ticket to play a big leading role in a Hollywood blockbuster, but when it comes down to him playing roles in more character-driven films, that's really where he's going to have the opportunity to shine. And in this film, Cherry, he's going to have to portray a lot of heavy issues. He's going to have to basically go from being run-of-the-mill college kid to the intense rigors of military training to seeing live action, then bringing that all home with him, where him and his young wife are going to have to deal with that, and then he's going to turn to a life of crime to feed his addiction. And the wide range of levels that Tom Holland's character has to go through is pretty much broken up into different sections. Apparently it's broken down by the 6 chapters in the book, and the Russos essentially wanted to make each chapter feel like its own self-contained story. There are certain chapters that are more comedic, more lighthearted, but as you would expect in a movie that tackles this subject matter, there are sections of the film that are much more dramatic. And they not only distinguish that by the acting that's on screen, but in all the different elements that go into filmmaking. The lighting, the color palettes, the wardrobe, and all the other different things that are at the disposal to really create the feel of what's happening on screen. But, as we all know, the Russos do a tremendous job of relaying the message they've set out to tell to the audience in the work they do. And probably the craziest thing about this story is that it really happened to a certain degree. I mentioned the author of the book that this movie is based on, Nico Walker, and Cherry, for all intents and purposes, is the story of his life. He dropped out of college at 19, joined the Army, where he was a medic. He went on 250 missions, and when he returned to civilian life, he had undiagnosed PTSD, was dealing with depression, and he became hooked on heroin. And he legitimately robbed banks to fund his addiction. Over a span of 4 months, he robbed 10 different banks in the Ohio area. He was arrested in April of 2011, pled guilty when he was arraigned in 2012, for which he received an 11-year sentence. He's now out of prison, and hopefully his demons are behind him, but his story is just crazy. And I guess luckily for him, people reached out to him while he was in prison and encouraged him to write his story, which resulted in the book Cherry, and when the Russos heard about it, Joe Russo called him immediately and said, "This is the next movie that I have to work on," which just shows how personally connected he felt to this story. And everybody's got to work, but when filmmakers feel a personal connection to the material they're committing to screen, that always translates to a better, more engaging product. So I think it's great that they have this kinship to this story. It's terrible that they've had to experience things that gave them the personal connection to this story, but from an artistic standpoint, it's going to make this film all that much better. And another thing that'll make this film great is the cast. Like I mentioned before, Tom Holland is in the lead role, and he went through a very grueling process to make his character as authentic as possible, including losing reportedly a quarter of his body weight, which just shows you the level of dedication he's bringing to this role. Opposite Tom Holland, in the role of his wife Emily, is the young Sierra Bravo, who is probably best known for her role in the Amazon Prime Video series Wayne. And the Wahlberg acting dynasty continues, with Brandon Wahlberg being in this film. He, of course, is the nephew of Mark, Donnie, and Arthur Wahlberg. Another cast member keeping up the family acting tradition is Mike Gandolfini, and he, of course, is the son of the late James Gandolfini. And another major player in this film is Jack Renner, who is probably best known for his role as Christian in Midsummer, plays the role of Pills and Coke. So he has a very interesting character name. But the winner of the Best Name combination is the actor Forrest Goodluck, who plays the character James Lightfoot. So this relatively young cast will be taking on the challenge of telling a very emotional story that varies in tone from lighthearted and comedic at certain points to being extremely dark and emotional at different points of the film. So once again, the film is Cherry, directed by the Russo brothers, and it will be available on Apple TV Plus starting March 12th, so check it out. But right now on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we are going to take a break, but don't go anywhere. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the new cyber thriller, Dark Web Cicada 3301, which was based on true events surrounding an online secret society that was recruiting hackers. And this film takes a look at cybersecurity and the very real issue of people's private data being exposed and accessible online. I will then be taking a look at the film Truth, which centers around a couple who owns an art gallery and how their relationship is put to the test. Also, be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as we will be taking a look at the film The Godfather, given that it debuted in theaters 49 years ago this week. All that coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast, so stick around, and we will be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Rich McDonough, and I just wrapped up talking about the film Cherry, which is set for release March 12th on Apple TV+. It is directed by the Russo brothers and stars Tom Holland, telling the story about an Army veteran who develops an opioid addiction, which results in him turning to a life of bank robbing in order to fund his addiction. So once again, that film is Cherry, and it will be available on Apple TV Plus March 12th. But right now I want to talk about the new cyber thriller, Dark Web Cicada 3301, and be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I will be taking a look at the classic film The Godfather, because this week we are celebrating its 49th anniversary, and I am right there with you. I'm disappointed it's not the 50th year anniversary, because if it were, I'm sure there would be a lot of cast reunions and different panels about the film, but we will still have fun with the topic. But for right now, we are going to get to the film at hand. So this film, Dark Web Cicada 3301, is based on true events and centers around a set of unsolved mysteries where people from the dark web were posting puzzles online, the first of which was on the site 4chan in 2012, and they were doing this in order to recruit code breakers from the public. The idea beggars belief, but apparently you can't make this up. And another thing that you can't make up about this film is the unlikely director and star of the film, Alan Ritchson. And for those of you who know him, know that he has a history of playing very outlandish characters. Probably the role he's most synonymous with is the role of Thad Castle from the Spike TV hit Blue Mountain State. And to anyone who's seen him play that character, who is pretty much just an overgrown man-child playing college football, it's crazy to think he's acting in a film like this, let alone directing it. And I'm not saying he doesn't have the ability, but for those of you who know the ridiculous things that he did in Blue Mountain State, it's hard to separate that character from the actor, which again just speaks to his ability, because everything I've seen him in that isn't Blue Mountain State, he is absolutely nothing like his character. I'm really surprised that he has made the transition to director. This film will act as his directorial debut, and he is taking on both a very complex story and a very complex issue. Like I said before, this is based on true events where members of the dark web were posting puzzles to recruit online codebreakers. And for those who don't know what the dark web is, I really don't know that much about it in detail. What I can say about it is it's a place where, I guess, illegal activity goes on. So quite frankly, if you don't know about it, consider yourself lucky. But this film, while being a way to entertain people, may also be a very good way to enlighten people as to what is out there on the internet and the real threats there are when it comes to cybersecurity. And to give a quick snapshot of the premise, I did say earlier this was inspired by true events, and it seems as though it's very loosely based around those true events. The true events were that this organization, Cicada 3301, was posting online puzzles for people to solve in an attempt to recruit online hackers. This film appears to be taking just the idea of a secret organization that operates online and building out their own story from there. In the trailer, it's described as the IT department of the Illuminati. So the film is based around the main character Connor being discovered by this group and him getting pulled into their recruitment efforts while he's also being contacted by the NSA. So this film really is a secret society crime drama, but it is being taken to the next level and also involving cybersecurity and the criminal threats we now face in this digital age, which I think is a very overlooked thing in our society in general, just how much personal information people are putting online. Of course, companies are buying it for ad research in order to more efficiently reach their target audience. But what this film is going to do is shed a light on people that look for personal data for more sinister means. The whole plot gets kicked off by the main character, Connor Black, cyberstalking a guy he gets into a fight with at a bar and sending him a virus-ridden email. Now, that's a pretty low-life thing to do for the protagonist of a film, but it highlights the concept of there being so much accessible personal information out there. And because he sends this email, he gets on the radar of Cicada 3301, and we're off to the races from there. To give you a quick rundown of the cast, the main character I've been talking about, Connor Black, he is played by Jack Kesey, who is probably best known for his role in Deadpool 2 as Black Tom. He is also a cast member on the terrible-looking TNT original series Claws. And to be fair, I have not seen that show, but just from watching the trailers, and if your show is named after gaudy, oversized, ridiculous-looking fake nails, I just have a hard time believing there's any entertainment value to it. But I won't knock him for his past roles. Actors gotta work. Also, I believe I mentioned earlier that director Alan Ritchson doubles as an actor in this film. He plays NSA Agent Carver. Actor Ron Funches seems to be playing the main comic relief in this film. Connor Leslie is also in the film, who is a tremendous actress, which she proved in her starring role as Trudy in Amazon's The Man in the High Castle. But overall, with a few exceptions, this film has a cast of relatively unknown actors, so hopefully this is an opportunity for them to make a name for themselves. And this film, being an action thriller, will put them in a lot of tense, compromising situations. So watching the dynamics of the main characters having to deal with a secret society will be very compelling. And again, it's just so crazy for me to think of the guy from Blue Mountain State is directing a film that is tackling such a serious issue. And in doing research for this podcast, I actually discovered that he was on American Idol back in one of the earlier seasons, and his audition was essentially just him serenading Paula Abdul, with them flirting back and forth at each other. So this is just another example of it's not how you start, it's how you finish. But one thing that was strange is that when I was doing research for this podcast to talk about this film, there doesn't seem to be a lot of interviews about it, people promoting the film, talking about it, the making of it. And personally, I would love to hear what Ritchson has to say about his directorial debut, especially since he co-wrote the script. And with this being the first original project from Freaker Films, which is a film fund that he runs. So I find it strange that for someone who is so invested in a project from soup to nuts, not being out there and doing press on it. Obviously, he can't do the traditional press tour that's done in non-pandemic times, but I can't find him posting so much as a tweet about the film, which is slightly out of character for him because when he was trying to make the film version of Blue Mountain State, he was involved in that all the way from the beginning. He started the original Kickstarter campaign that got it funded, and even went on Jimmy Kimmel in character. So I usually love to give thoughts from the filmmakers and the actors involved in making a movie, but so far, I haven't found a single word out of any of them. But who knows, maybe this is all feeding into the secret society element of this film, or maybe they're even being suppressed by the dark web. And the real organization of Cicada 3301 does not want this film highly publicized. And imagine if that were the case. But this film does touch on a very concerning issue, and that is the fact that as people grow more dependent on technology and start sharing their personal information, whether it's simply just with a device or on social media networks, they are running the risk that hackers could steal that information. And who's to say if cybersecurity is keeping pace with these threats? Not to get anyone paranoid or wearing their tinfoil hat, but it is worth thinking about. I once dated a girl in college who said that she didn't have social media of any kind because she didn't want any of her personal information out there. Now, at the time, I thought it was a little strange. Having grown up in the social media age, it's kind of just commonplace for me. But now, looking back, she may have been onto something. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about this rabbit hole and how your behavior online is tracked and monitored, I suggest you take a look at the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. This documentary takes a look at that very issue and how the programmers and engineers at these companies, such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Instagram, are collecting information about your interests and using it to curate content back to you. And this is a concerning topic, not just from how they collect data on individuals, but how information spreads through them. Now, there are groups like QAnon out there that spread false news, and it's reported that false news spreads 6 times faster than true news, which I find incredibly concerning. And right now, this generation of human beings are essentially dealing with Pandora's box being open. We're the first generation of people that have to deal with this. And we're going to run into issues like there being cyber criminals that want to recruit code breakers. We are going to have to learn about the proper ways to make sure that our information is kept private. And I think the film Dark Web, Cicada 3301, is going to shed a lot of light on the extreme consequences that can manifest themselves when you're dealing with cyber criminals and the overall issue of cybersecurity, which is only going to become more prevalent in the years to come. And I don't mean to alarm people out there with this notion that there are secret societies out there hacking and stealing personal information, but it is something that you have to accept as a real possibility out there. And it's not just something confined to the world of crime. Companies are doing it. Like I said when I was referring to the documentary, The Social Dilemma, social media companies are monitoring every single thing you do on their platforms. Other companies with products and services to sell, they have access to unbelievable levels of information on you. For instance, Google is aware if you have had a child, if you've gotten married, and whether or not you're a homeowner. Not only that, but the search results that you are provided with when you type something into Google is curated towards your interests. So you aren't necessarily being provided with the most accurate information, you're being provided with the information most likely to appeal to your sensibilities. And that's something I think is one of the biggest problems with media in general today, across all platforms. The fact that people can just get stuck in an echo chamber and have certain ideas completely reinforced while having other ideas completely dismissed just based on someone's preferences. And everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but when we stop accepting facts for what they are and only accept information that appeals to us, that's how misinformation is spread and people with sinister intentions take advantage. And this film is meant to highlight what happens when people with sinister intentions have access to your most personal information, how they are then able to manipulate you and essentially control your actions. So hopefully this film, Dark Web, Cicada 3301, does a lot to educate people on the dangers of having your personal information displayed on public platforms. Now, that being said, there's no easy answer to how we should approach this going forward as a society. Is social media inherently a bad thing? I personally don't take that point of view, but people should be more conscious of the information that they're putting out there and making public, and understand the ramifications of those actions. So, I'm glad there's a film taking aim at this issue, and hats off to Alan Ritchson, who pretty much was involved in this from development stages all the way through, bringing it to life on the big screen. Now I just wish he gave even the smallest of interviews about it, so I had a little bit more to talk about. But if he wants to let his film do the talking for itself, that is completely fine. Once again, the film is Dark Web Cicada 3301, and it will be available starting on March 12th through video on demand. And to recap the film, it follows computer hacker Connor Black, bites off a little more than he can chew, and discovers that there's an entire secret society of online cybercriminals. Once again, this film is inspired by true events, so if you want to take a look at how far the rabbit hole really goes, definitely check it out. Right now, however, we're going to take a break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around as we are going to be talking about the movie Truth in our next segment. And I'll tell the listeners right now, I'm talking about this film for two reasons pretty much. One, I want to make sure that I'm bringing diverse content to this show and talking about films that will appeal to different audiences. But also, there are some aspects of this film I find just so laughable, and I really want to make fun of them. So this film, Truth, centers around a couple that owns an art gallery. So right off the bat, they're super relatable to an audience. And the couple is growing concerned about each other having feelings for other people. But the thing is, they don't do anything to avoid putting themselves in compromising situations. For instance, at one point in the film, the wife goes to Paris with a male artist that she is admittedly attracted to. And I know that a story needs conflict, but just the sheer believability of that happening and the audience to believe that you're actually in a situation like that through sheer happenstance, stories structured like that just sounds a tad lazy to me. So it will not be a non-stop rip fest of the film Truth, but there are definitely elements I want to take a look at. And definitely be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as we are going to be commemorating the 49th anniversary of the Godfather's release. So don't go anywhere, because we will be right back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the new cyber thriller, Dark Web, Cicada 3301, set for release March 12th. And that film centers around a hacker that gets introduced to a secret online community of cybercriminals and bites off a little bit more than he can chew. So if you are a fan of the mystery thriller drama, definitely check it out. Right now I will be talking about the new film Truth, which is a romance drama that centers around a couple who owns an art studio and the temptations they face outside of their relationship. But also be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I will be taking a look at the film The Godfather, given that this week will be its 49th anniversary of release. And any opportunity I have to talk about one of the true classics in cinema, I am going to take it. But right now we are going to talk about the film Trust, which is set for release Friday, March 12th. And I did give a little preview in the earlier segment. I do want to make sure I'm not leaving out types of movies that are in different genres that traditionally wouldn't be my cup of tea. I really do want to bring diverse content. And whether or not that means I'm examining a children's film I'm never going to watch, if that means I'm taking a look at a romantic drama that I'm never going to watch, that's what I want to do.
So I will highlight some compelling points that this film has going for it, but I really have to say there is a lot about this story that I just have to make fun of. And I won't be giving away anything that wasn't included in the trailer, but just from watching the trailer, there are certain things about just the way the story is structured. Sounds a tad ridiculous, and again, I know all stories need conflict to move them along, so that ultimately you can arrive at a resolution, but just how some of these things are posed from the trailer just make absolutely no sense. But to give you a little background on this film first, it is based off of a play called Push, and this has no relation to Precious, based on the novel Push by Sapphire. This is Trust, based on the play Push by Kristen Lazarian. That sounds like a Mad Lib. But to give a quick synopsis of this film, the film follows the characters of Brooke and Owen, who live in New York City. They manage an art gallery. And like I said, super relatable. Everyone can identify with the rigors of running an art gallery. But in all seriousness, I'm sure that them running an art gallery is supposed to be an allegory for there's attractive things all around you in the world, as the major theme in this film is temptation. And that temptation is first introduced when they sign a new artist, whose name is Ansgar, but for the purposes of this podcast, he is going to be referred to as Pervy McGee. He is a painter that pretty much deals with only painting nude women, and when he first meets the husband Owen, he pretty much points out all the things that he finds attractive about his wife Brooke. So there is not much subtlety to this character. He's coming in to be the homewrecker. And of the things about this story I have a problem with, I don't really have a problem with the character being like that. Without question, there are guys that just feel the need to lift their leg and mark their territory and quote-unquote prove their masculinity. I just find it a little ironic that someone who's a painter for a living is trying to do that. But anyway, so Pervy McGee meets the husband, tells the husband he finds his wife attractive. Later on, the wife tells the husband she is going to Paris with Pervy McGee after they had a conversation about how they cannot go on a trip. So the husband is now concerned about his wife going to Paris with Pervy McGee after being flat out told that Pervy McGee is attracted to his wife. And he has the intent to ultimately make a move on her. And at this point, the wife sees no problem with it. It's just business. And she doesn't understand her husband's concern about her going to what many people call the city of love with another man who has expressed interest in being with her. So that right there is just where I have a hard time believing that these events are realistic, but then again, it is a film. It is a place where you're allowed to let your imagination run wild, but it is presented that Owen and Brooke's relationship is pretty great. So if it was as open and trusting a relationship, why would Owen be actually concerned about his wife cheating on him? And if Brooke, who is admittedly attracted to this man, why then would she put herself in a situation that could result in them getting together? And again, I understand stories need conflicts. Frustration is what keeps an audience engaged. But to the point where a husband is concerned about his wife spending time with another man where there's mutual attraction between them, and the wife just being like, oh, it's fine, no, don't worry about it, just seems a little unbelievable. And in the trailer, after they've established that she's going to be going to Paris with this man, there's a lot of quick cuts to keep the viewer engaged, but the very next line you hear from her is, I may have made a huge mistake. No way. But, like I said earlier, all stories need conflicts. I just wanted to take some shots at the things I found wrong with the story setup. But there we have plot A. Wife is off with Pervy McGee in Paris. Plot B is husband is home while that is happening. And what does he do to keep his mind occupied during that time? He goes to a bar where all great decisions go to hang out. And there he runs into a seductive journalist who recognizes him from some public interest pieces he has done. I should also mention he is a journalist in addition to owning the gallery with his wife. So, here is the main setup of the film. Married couple in separate places with different people, and their fidelity is put to the test. And while there are things about the story in general that I have enjoyed taking shots at, The main thing this film is trying to say is sometimes people that are in committed relationships are put into compromising situations, and at those times you have to choose what is right and what is wrong. So while I can poke fun at how the characters are arriving at their destinations, that shouldn't undercut the fact that this film is going to put the main characters in extremely complicated positions where they are going to have to go through emotional turmoil, and the sheer drama that is created off of that is going to be the real spectacle to behold in this film. So if you're a fan of seeing drama play out, if you're a fan of love triangles and the decisions that the characters have to make and the different directions they're pulled in, or if you're like me and just enjoy yelling at the screen saying, "What are you doing?" this film seems to have a little bit of all of that. And again, me personally, I'm not really a huge fan of the romance drama. And the main reason for that is I think that the conflicts in these type of movies are just so manufactured. We need them to be apart because they're supposed to be apart. So the payoff at the end is all the better for it. And the ultimate example I give of this is, what's that movie? It's this movie with Matthew McConaughey. What is this? Kate Hudson's in it. It's How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. So a little bit of story time on why I ended up watching this film. My senior year of college, I lived with my school's basketball team. It was a little townhouse, and just through random room selection, I got the room that was open in it. All the rest of the people in the house were on the basketball team. And I lucked out. Those guys were great. But back to how I ended up seeing this movie. That year, they made it to the Sweet 16 for Division II basketball, and one of their games was in Philly, and there was a bus going down there for anyone who wanted to see the game. It was on a Tuesday, I had no classes, let's do it. As it turns out, I'm the only dude on this bus. Pretty much everyone else on the bus is dating someone on the team. And this is a 5-hour bus drive, I have no way to charge my phone or my laptop, don't have Wi-Fi, and I'm trying to conserve batteries on all my devices. So, pretty much the only thing to do was to watch the movies that were playing. We start off with Mean Girls. Perfect. I can do this. Great film. Funny. Directed by Tina Fey, who I think is one of the funniest storytellers out there. So we're starting the movies on a high note. And boy, oh boy, did the palatability fall off a cliff from there. Up next is How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. And the main premise is Kate Hudson's character is trying to find out how she can get a guy to break up with her within 10 days. Matthew McConaughey's character, conversely, has made a bet that he can make a woman fall in love with him within 10 days. What are the chances? I know. But I remember just watching this film, and this was in college when I was taking film courses, like learning how things were structured and how you make a story naturally progress. And the entire time I was watching this, I was just thinking, they're just writing down scenarios on awkward situations the characters can get into, and then just put them in a sequence. And again, all stories need conflicts. That's what makes a story compelling, and that is what the audience invests in. But I am a big believer in strange alchemy, which is a storytelling term that refers to when you put elements together, like if you put a certain character in a situation. By simply having those characters' traits defined, you will arrive at the natural conclusion of how they will act in a situation like that. To give a very cliche example, if it's a Western and there are two gunslingers that both claim to be the best, it's inevitable that they are going to cross paths and get into a gunfight. And in simpler terms, it simply means the most likely conclusion is the correct conclusion. And that's something I just see as a flaw in most romantic movies. A lot of the conflicts are half-baked, and most of them are simply there because we need to have a conflict here. They're not very organic, and if you take a step back and examine all the elements going into it, the behavior of the character just doesn't line up with what we've been told about them. So that's my main gripe at romance films in general. I'm sorry that I'm picking on trust for that, and I'm sorry if I'm discouraging anyone who would be interested in this film. I really don't mean to do that. There were just a few things with this film that when I was doing research on it just set off a red flag in my head being like, that doesn't make any sense. But what I will say about this film, no matter how these characters are arriving at their situations, it does seem like it will have these characters facing very complex issues, so it will make for good drama. And if you're looking for a film that will take you on an emotional roller coaster, I think Trust will definitely deliver in that sense. And if people want me to be more positive towards the film, I can say that it seems to have a very talented cast. With Victoria Justice in the lead role of Brooke. Most people will probably know her from her work as a child star in her own show Victorious and Zoe 101. She was kind of Nickelodeon's answer to Hannah Montana, when there were a bunch of shows coming out trying to duplicate the success of that and Miley Cyrus. And playing her husband, Owen, is Matthew Daddario, who's probably best known for his work on the show Shadowhunters, where he played Alec Lightwood. And joining him in this film is fellow Shadowhunters alumni, Catherine McNamara, also starred in the CW hit Arrow. She plays Amy, who is probably best described as Owen's temptation in this film. Playing Brooke's temptation and the person I affectionately called Pervy McGee, whose character's actual name is Ansgar, is Lucene Laviscount, who has starred in the show Snatch as Billy, I cannot say his nickname on this podcast, Ayers. Other minor cast members include Rosa Gilmore, who had a starring role in the Amazon Prime Video original, The Expanse, and Ronnie Chang, who is probably best known for his work on The Daily Show. He is absolutely hilarious, so do yourself a favor, after watching Trust, go check out his Netflix specials.
But all joking and my amateur film analysis aside, Trust does seem like it's going to be a film that is going to have high drama, major conflicts, and very emotional moments. So if you're a fan of that type of film, don't let my critiques of the film stop you from enjoying a movie. So once again, the film is Trust. It will be debuting March 12th via video on demand. So get the home theater ready. But right now, we're going to take a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast. But don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we're going to be talking about the all-time classic, The Godfather, which made its world premiere March 14th, 1972. So I wanted to talk about it to commemorate the 49th anniversary. I do really wish that this was 1 year later so we could get to that nice round number of 50, but that does not detract from the cultural significance this film had and how it really was an unprecedented film at its time of release. On the surface, it was a gangster film, which at that time there had been many that had preceded it, but this was really one of the very first films to make the people that are breaking the law the protagonists and portray them as extremely complex, deep characters. Not to mention that it has one of the greatest ensemble casts of all time, with Marlon Brando portraying the titular character, with incredible actors like Al Pacino, James Caan, Robert Duvall, John Cazale, and Talia Shire playing his children, with other incredible actors like Diane Keaton and Abe Vigoda in supporting roles. There is not a single weak point in terms of the casting of this movie. The script is amazing, producing lines such as, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse." This film has just really stood the test of time and just become part of American culture. To give you an idea of its influence, there have been 300 gangster films centering around Italian Americans since this movie came out, and that's an average of 9 a year. So just the sheer influence it's had on the industry is something to behold. And that's what I'm going to be diving in when we get back on the GSMC Movie Podcast. So don't go anywhere.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Rich McDonough, and I just wrapped up talking about the movie Trust, based on the play Push, which will be available via video on demand starting March 12th, and it details the story of a couple and their struggle to stay loyal to one another. So if you are into the over-the-top romance genre, definitely check it out. But right now, I will be shifting away from new releases to talking about one of the greatest films ever made, as I commemorate the 49th anniversary of Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. And for everyone saying the 49th anniversary isn't anything special, you should wait till the 50th to make a show talking about The Godfather. Ever since, about a year ago, I have this thing about putting things off. So, we are going to talk about it now. And one thing about this film, no matter what year it is, no matter how long ago it came out, this film still has a tremendous amount of staying power and truly is an absolute classic piece of cinema. And the film was adopted from Mario Puzo's 1969 book of the same name. Puzo would also be brought in to write the script with Francis Ford Coppola. And even though this is one of the most famous movies ever made, I'm gonna give people that have been living under a rock a quick synopsis of the film. It is set starting in 1945 and spans 10 years. And over that time period, we follow the lives of the Corleone crime family. The main actors in this film are Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, Robert Duvall, James Caan, John Cazale, Diane Keaton, and Talia Shire. And that cast alone gives it a special place in cinema history. But there are so many more things about this film that not only make it great, but make it worth exploring and examining. And I think one of the best ways to understand the messaging of this film is to just take a look at the first scene. And before I get into that, I just want to mention that one of the most lasting images of The Godfather, specifically the title sequence, is the crossbar, which is an apparatus used to control a marionette. And that relays the idea the film is trying to tell, that there is someone operating in the shadows, pulling the strings, and that action produces what is seen in the light. And that is exactly how Francis Ford Coppola opens his film. The movie starts with a close-up on someone who is telling the story of how his daughter was assaulted to a figure that is off-screen. And as his story progresses, the camera pulls out to reveal that he is talking to somebody who is brought into frame via zooming out and settling on an over-the-shoulder shot. This is Marlon Brando's character, the Godfather, Vito Corleone, and the man talking to him is asking for him to kill the men that have assaulted his daughter. The main reason this meeting is taking place is because it is the day of the Godfather's only daughter's wedding. And there is an old Sicilian tradition that a Sicilian cannot refuse any request made on the day of his daughter's wedding. And this main conversation is taking place in a very dim room, while just outside the window, an enormous party is going on. So, right off the bat, this idea that there are deals made in the shadows, where sinister activities are being discussed behind closed doors, while all outward appearances are sunny and rosy. And this opening scene isn't only important because it introduces us to the main character of the film, but it establishes the dynamics within this family right off the bat. In the dark room with the Godfather is his son, Sonny, played by James Caan, and his adopted son, played by Robert Duvall. They are a part of the family business. They know how things operate, and they are part of the dirty work that happens in this crime family. So by putting these three main characters in the same dark room at the beginning of the film, it is established what their roles are. On the flip side, his three other children are outside at the wedding. The bride, whose wedding it is Carla, played by Talia Shire, and she has nothing to do with the family business because there is this theme in The Godfather that it is the job of the men to take care of the dirty work. But one of the male members of the Corleone family outside enjoying the festivities is Fredo, played by John Cazale, and he is drunk when we first are introduced to him. And this is to illustrate that he is unreliable, and therefore unfit to be a part of the family business. And the final member of the Corleone family that is outside enjoying the wedding is Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino. And he is outside and away from the inner circle of the family's inner workings, not because he is unfit, but because his father wants him to be away from the family business. It is Vito's goal for his youngest son to have a life outside of crime. And this is further highlighted from a character perspective of him having a life away from the family by him being at the wedding with his girlfriend, Kate Adams, who was played by Diane Keaton. So, within the very first scene, we are introduced to all the characters, and it is immediately made clear to the audience which members of the family play which roles. Sonny, the firstborn son, is placed literally at the right hand of his father, both on screen and in a narrative perspective. Tom, his adopted son, is also a part of that life, but is a little bit further away. Fredo is unreliable, and therefore best left outside of the picture. Carla is the quintessential princess, given that this entire celebration is for her. And Michael was consciously chosen to be kept away from the family business so that he wouldn't have to deal with these issues and be free to operate in the light, so to speak. And ultimately, this is Michael's story, and about how, despite the best intentions to keep him away from the family business, his loyalty to his family is ultimately what drives him. And there are so many subtle elements throughout this film that point to Michael's fate, ultimately. In this opening scene, he's wearing his medals from the war. He served in World War II, and what do you get war medals for? For killing people. So despite the fact that he is one of the characters that is shown outside in the light, we are subtly being told that underneath his shiny medals and his official-looking uniform, this is a killer. So despite the fact that he has been groomed for a life away from crime, it is part of his nature. And in a scene later in the movie, as Michael begins his turn from the quote-unquote goody two-shoes to a full-fledged member of the family business, it takes place in the same room we are introduced to his father. Only now, instead of everyone paying attention to Vito Corleone, they are paying attention to what Michael has to say. And I understand that The Godfather was adopted from a book, but just the way that Francis Ford Coppola translates it into a different medium, how he presents it to the audience with these incredibly subtle yet at the same time obvious methods of storytelling. Those are the things that separate filmmaking from just pure entertainment to truly being art.
And that's why I feel it's worth talking about a film that came out 49 years ago. And this isn't your typical gangster movie where it's built around a bunch of shoot-'em-up scenes. This movie is 3 hours long, and it is carried mainly on the backs of the actors bringing these characters to life and portraying the dynamic they have in this family. And that's why when it was released, it won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Marlon Brando won the Academy Award for Best Actor, though he famously refused the award. It had 3 more of its actors, James Caan, Al Pacino, and Robert Duvall, nominated for Best Supporting Actor. And the only reason one of them didn't win was because they were taking votes away from each other. On IMDb, it's ranked the second greatest movie of all time, with a rating of 9.2 out of 10, having had over 1.5 million people vote on it. It trails only The Shawshank Redemption. Furthermore, in terms of ratings, by Rotten Tomato, it has a 90% rating from both critics and audiences. So in terms of sheer accolades, it clearly measures up as one of the best films of all time, but it still resonates with audiences so many years after it came out, to the point where AMC has a non-stop Godfather marathon around Thanksgiving. How lines from it are just part of the cultural lexicon, such as I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, and it's just business, nothing personal. This film is ingrained in American culture. And for those of you listening who haven't seen the film, I encourage you to set aside 3 hours out of your day. And I know that's a big ask in this age of instant gratification, but the visual story that's being told is worth your investment. And I keep fawning over the cast. Let me give you a picture as to why. This film had 4 cast members that would either already or go on to win the Academy Award for Best Actor or Actress. As I said earlier, Marlon Brando would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Actor for this film, having previously won it for his performance in On the Waterfront. Robert Duvall would go on to win for Tender Mercies in 1982, and Diane Keaton would go on to win Best Actress for her performance in Annie Hall. And finally, my favorite actor, Al Pacino, would go on to win in 1992 for his performance in Scent of a Woman. And at the time when he was cast in the role of Michael for The Godfather, he had only been in 1 film prior to that, the 1971 picture Panic in Needle Park, where he played a heroin addict. So just the fact that this was his second ever film role makes his performance all the more impressive. And those are just the actors in the film that were recognized with awards. James Caan would go on to have an incredibly illustrious career. Talia Shire would obviously go on to portray Adrian in the Rocky movies. And one actor, John Cazale, who often gets overlooked in film history because his career was tragically cut short, having unfortunately passed away due to lung cancer in 1979. But just to give you an idea of how good an actor he was, he only made 5 feature-length films. Every single one of them was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. And for those interested in another piece of trivia, he used to date Meryl Streep. But getting back to the immense talent of this cast, not a single moment of this film is offbeat. Every single one of them completely nails the character that they're portraying. And that's hard to do when you're ranging from moments that are incredibly hostile in one scene, and in the same moment, you have to shift to being tender and loving to your family. And the fact that Francis Ford Coppola was able to portray these incredibly complex emotions and characters on screen so successfully is what makes this film such a tremendous accomplishment. And that's why, 49 years later, I am compelled to talk about it.
And to give you some insight into a few more of its accolades, in 1998, for the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Movies, it was named the 3rd best film of all time, coming in only behind Citizen Kane and Casablanca. It was also submitted to the National Film Registry as a film worth preserving due to its cultural significance. The film would also spawn 2 sequels, The Godfather Part 2 and 3. The Godfather Part 2 is considered the greatest sequel of all time, and Part 3 not so much. And to show that I'm not the only one who thinks that this film is still relevant nowadays, there is a film being made that is titled Francis and the Godfather, and the film covers what Francis Ford Coppola had to go through in order to get this film made. The film is set to star Oscar Isaac, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Ellie Fanning. Now, as far as a release date goes, that is still unclear, but that is to be expected in the times we are living in. But it is clear to see that The Godfather is a film that resonates with both critics and audiences of all generations. Despite the fact that the story was very much a product of its time and based off of real-life mafioso members that were operating in New York, the core message of this film is completely timeless. And that is a message of loyalty and family being the most important thing. Which, when you look at it like that, it's easy to see why audiences around the world and of all different ages connect with this film on so many different levels. We all have families, and all families have skeletons in their closets. Now, hopefully, your family's skeletons are more so that they embarrass you, and not that they operate a criminal enterprise on the side. But despite the circumstances, that is what this film is trying to relay in terms of its message. Yes, it has the window dressings of a criminal drama and a crime thriller, but ultimately, this is about what members in a family will do and the lengths they will go to protect their family. And that's something everyone can get behind, and allows you to overlook the fact that the protagonists are criminals. When a story is told as well and as flawlessly as this one was, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, as long as you are engaging the audience to the level where they feel like they are right there with this family and invested in it as much as they are. That's what really matters in storytelling, and that's what The Godfather accomplished so well so many years ago, and why it has endured since that time. Now, I could go on and talk about this film for hours on end, dissect a lot more scenes, talk way more about the actors, all the behind-the-scenes fun they had together, different elements of how this film was produced, all the fun trivia that goes along with this film, but I do have a time limit. So I do encourage you, if you have not already seen The Godfather, to check it out. Ways to watch it are on the new Paramount Plus platform. So if you were looking to check that out, I couldn't think of a better reason. Or if you want to set yourself a reminder for Thanksgiving, it will be playing on AMC, as it is year after year. Or you could always go out and buy the DVD like a cave person. But in all seriousness, The Godfather is truly one of the greatest pieces of cinema ever made. And if you're looking for a movie full of substance, great acting, incredible storytelling, great cinematography, this film really has it all. And I wanted to thank everyone who let me talk about it and scratch this itch, as on March 14th, it will be the 49th anniversary anniversary of it debuting in theaters. So I thank you all for that, and I just want to thank you in general for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, once again brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I also want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the show. And if you could write us a nice review, that really helps us a lot. Also, if you could follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Richard McDonough. I want to thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.